Good evening, everybody. Good evening, you guys that are tuning in from far away. I know it's in the middle of the night in some of you places, but I know that people from Ghana are tuning in, and some people from my home country of Suriname are tuning in. It's not midnight over there, it's just 3 hours later. But, and some other places, people are tuning in. Welcome. When you tune in, it encourages us. So, yes. So, welcome to you as well. And I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad that Dr. Fruchtenbaum is here with us tonight. And I love his teaching. I have listened to his teaching for 40 years. And always something is in his teaching that I find not only refreshing, but sort of new. He seems to discover things that I don't discover, you know, and I discover them through him. So I like it when he comes, and he's been coming here for a number of years now. I love when he comes. He has a lot of people from other places that like to come, that like to hear him teach, and so we're delighted. He has a book table over there. I don't know anybody, haven't read of anybody, haven't heard of anybody that writes as much as he writes. The volume of work that he has put out, if there were such a thing as the, how you call it, the Hall of Fame or whatever, then he should be in it. Is there such a thing as a Christian Hall of Fame? Christians probably wouldn't want to be in that thing. Yeah, that's right. So you know, we get that over there. So, so much work and so much discovery, yes. Unabridged study Bible. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Yes. So the schedule is that tonight he's going to talk about the last Passover and the first Lord's Supper. And typically thinking, well, I know about the Passover, I know about the Lord's Supper, but my experience is that when he teaches, I always hear something new. Yes. And then tomorrow, and that's tonight at 7 o'clock, as you well know, and tomorrow night at 7 o'clock as well, the ordinance of baptism. And once again, well, I know a little bit about baptism, okay? But, you know, then you'll hear something new. And it is always refreshing to me. I'm thinking, wow, how come I didn't think of it? And then Sunday morning at 10:45, it'd be but the rapture of the church, part 1. And then Sunday evening, 6 o'clock, whereas Friday and Saturday were 7. Sunday night at 6 o'clock, the rapture of the church, part 2. So you know him. That's why you're here. And so, Dr. Fruchtenbaum, would you come and bless us? So we don't do worship when he comes on the nights. We don't do worship. And Sunday night we won't do worship. Tonight it's about teaching. Okay, so sometimes it's about teaching, sometimes it's about praying, sometimes it's about worship. So Sunday morning we'll have a brief worship, and then he'll be teaching as well. Thank you very much.
Are we on? What I want to do tonight is, first of all, take a few minutes to discuss what is an ordinance biblically, other names for this thing. And then we're going to focus on the Passover and the Lord's Last Supper. You have a one-page outline. That is the order of the Passover. We will not be tackling with that outline at the beginning. Towards the end, after we deal with the various elements about the Lord's Supper, at that point we're going to be able to deal with that list of things, because that's the order of the Jewish Passover, the way it's normally conducted. Let's begin with ordinances, and one title for it is sacrament. And generally the term sacrament is that somehow through partaking of the sacraments, one does some receiving some extra grace. Are we on? Okay. The term sacrament usually conveys the concept that by partaking of the baptism, partaking of the Lord's table, that are somehow conveying a grace through that ritual. At Roman Catholicism, they add a little factor that also conveys saving value. And so babies who are baptized in their sprinkling system, again, if they die in infancy, they'll go to heaven, but those who are not baptized will go into another place, not hell, but go into a place which is a neutral zone, what they have with those babies on who are not baptized are going to be. But these issues are nowhere taught anywhere in Scripture. A better term then would be the term ordinance, which means something that is a prescribed rite or prescribed practice. And it's viewed as anything, an outward practice that the Messiah has given us to practice. And it's an element that will go with the meeting of the church. So basically, an ordinance can be defined this way: an outward practice appointed by the Messiah to be administered in the church as a visible sign of the saving truth of the believer's faith. It's a visible sign, only a visible sign of saving faith. In order for something to be qualified as an ordinance, three things have been the requirements. First of all, it was commanded somewhere in the Gospels by Messiah himself. Secondly, we see it observed in the book of Acts. And thirdly, it's expounded upon theologically in the epistles. That is, you don't find a passage that says these are three elements which require it to be an ordinance. But from the totality of Scripture, these are the three things we see as being an ordinance. It was commanded by the Messiah, it was observed by the book of Acts, it was expounded upon in the epistles. Now, the number of ordinances differ in different groups. For example, Roman Catholicism, they have 7 different ordinances. And they include ordination, confirmation, matrimony, extreme unction, that's something you give to a person when he's soon to die, penance, baptism, and the Eucharist. I'll repeat those 7 Catholic ordinances: ordination, confirmation, matrimony, extreme unction, penance, baptism, and the Eucharist. In the Brethren denomination, they have 3 specific ordinances. That is baptism, communion, and also foot washing. And the foot washing becoming an ordinance in the Brethren Church is based upon John chapter 13, verses 12 through 15. John 13, verses 12 through 15, where the Messiah said, you should wash one another's feet. And in the Brethren theology, they believe this is a symbol of the atonement. But if you look at the context of John 13, verses 12 to 15, is simply emphasizing practicing humility. Simply emphasizing the practice of humility. It's not a symbol of the atonement, it's a symbol of cleansing. Cleansing of people already accepted the atonement. So it's not held by all 3 elements I mentioned. Nothing wrong with churches choosing to practice foot washing, but whether it's really an ordinance is not that clear. So 2 ordinances that we're going to be dealing with, one tonight and one tomorrow night, and that is communion tonight and baptism tomorrow. Now, why is it necessary to observe? Roman Catholicism and also Lutheranism to some measure teaches it has a regeneration value. Among certain Protestants, it's merely an act of obedience, or something along that line. So with that background, let's talk about the Lord's Supper. We'll deal with, first of all, the meaning. In Roman Catholicism, they believe in what is called transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, Transubstantiation, Stantiaion. And what they teach is that when the priest blesses the bread and blesses the cup, when he blesses the bread turns into the real body of the Messiah. When he blesses the wine, that turns into real blood of the Messiah. And in the early centuries of Catholicism, that they made some changes in more recent times, is that they give everybody the bread, but not everybody gets the wine. Only the priesthood gets the wine because of the danger of spilling some wine and therefore spilling the very blood of the Messiah. So bread for all, but wine was not for the laity because of danger of spilling the real blood. And this has been often a basis for anti-Semitic campaigns in Catholic countries, because when the priest blesses the bread, it turns to real body, and they claim that Jews would sneak into the church and grab some of those hosts that already been blessed by the priest, and they take it out and nail it to the cross to re-crucify the Messiah. And the embellishment also came that the host began to bleed. And many Jews lost their lives because of such a silly teaching. And the biblical basis, they say, well, the Messiah said, "This is my body, this is my blood." Therefore, it must be his real body, it must be his real blood. But if you look at John's gospel, he uses the word "I am" 7 different ways. Like for example, I am the gate of the sheep. Does he turn it into a real gate with a knob there? No. These are simply analogies. Furthermore, when Jesus spoke these words, "This is my body, this is my blood," guess what? He hadn't died yet. He died a little bit later. And furthermore, make the words, "This cup," it doesn't say this, "The wine is my blood," but "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." And if so how does the cup itself become his blood? Furthermore, these verses are found in the 6th chapter of John, and John was not dealing with the communion service. The analogy he made was with the manna that God brought bread out of heaven. So John is the only gospel writer that didn't even deal with the communion service. That's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not in John's gospel. So I'm saying this is the cup and so on would not relegate to that system of turning into real body and real blood. Now, Lutheranism has a different form. It's called consubstantiation. It's C-O-N, and the letters are all the same. And that, by consubstantiation, it comes from the Greek concept of being with. And so Lutherans do not believe that the bread turns into the real body of the Messiah, but does contain the real body. And the wine is not the real blood, but contains the real blood. So it's sort of a different way to analyze these things. However, they would simply say, well, the elements themselves do not change, as Catholicism teaches. But the body and the blood are physically present in the elements. But how they defend it is the same way the Roman Catholics defend their transubstantiation. Now Calvin and some other reformers, not all of them, other reformers claim it contains the spiritual presence of his body and the spiritual presence of his blood. So these elements do not change into these things, nor do they contain these things, but simply there is a spiritual presence of these things. And therefore, in Calvinism and certain Reformed movements, the basis is that sacrament becomes the basis or means of grace. But the fact is that if you look at all of the passages involved, the words do not imply any more than the Catholic view and the Lutheran view. Another reformer, Zwingli, and some others actually presented the key view that it was merely to be immemorial. And when the Messiah introduced these things, he used the word remembrance. If you ever sit through a full-scale Jewish Passover, which is what the outline we'll get to momentarily, the key word in the whole service is remember. We do this to remember that, we do that to remember this. And remembrance is the key word throughout the whole 3-4 hour service. And that's what the New Testament picks up. Remembrance. Do this in remembrance of me. So examples, in remembrance of me, Luke chapter 22, verse 19, Luke 22, 19. Also 1 Corinthians 11, verses 24 and 25, 1 Corinthians 11, 24 and 25. And 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26, he says, you show forth the Lord's death till he come. So this is the practice, and it's to continue until the second coming. Now, as far as scriptures that deal with this, there are 5 passages you should write down. In Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 26, verses 26 to 29, Matthew 26, 26 to 29. Mark chapter 14, verses 22 to 25, Mark 14, 22 to 25. Luke chapter 22, verses 14 to 20, Luke 22, verses 14 to 20. And twice in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 16 and 17, 1 Corinthians 10, verses 16 through 17, and chapter 11, verses 23 to 26. Chapter 11, verses 23 to 26. A variety of different names, not necessarily that they refer to the communion service, though they may. But one common name is the Lord's Supper. That's a common name in 1 Corinthians, found in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20. And literally, in Greek, it reads simply, of the Lord a supper. Of the Lord a supper. Now, the Greek word for Lord here is not a noun. It's an adjective in the Greek text. We don't have an adjective form of the term Lord. The only other place this term is found is Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. Revelation 1, verse 10, where it says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. But again, in Greek, the Lord is not a noun, it's an adjective. Should be rendered more like in Scotland, like they say, it was the Lordy day. We don't use that phrase in American English. But in Scottish English, they tend to use that phrase, it's the Lordy day. Doesn't refer to any specific day of the week, just that on that particular day, the Spirit took over John's faculties and was able to record what he recorded. It could have been any day of the week. And so using this term for the Lord's Supper, not Lord's Supper, but Lord's Supper, it may have a reference to the agape feast that precedes the actual act of partaking of the elements. Another phrase is the table of the Lord. The table of the Lord, you'll find this in 1 Corinthians 10:21. 1 Corinthians 10:21. In the context, there's no indication it's a definite reference to communion. It may be, but it's not really that clear. A third phrase is the breaking of the bread. It's used in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, Acts 2:42, and in Acts 20, verse 7, Acts 20, verse 7. Now, one term that is used is the word Eucharist. That's based on the Greek term simply meaning thanksgiving. So it was a table of thanksgiving. And it's used this way in Matthew 26, verse 27, Matthew 26, 27, and Mark 14, verse 23, Mark 14, 23. Where we find that form actually used of the Lord's table is Luke chapter 22, verses 17 and 19. Luke 22, verses 17 and 19, giving thanks. And 1 Corinthians 11, verse 24, 1 Corinthians 11, verse 24, having given thanks. Another term is eulogia, spelled E-U-L-O-G-I-A, E-U-L-O-G-I-A, meaning blessing. Blessing we bless. That's not necessarily a reference to the communion service, but it may be. The most common term nowadays in Protestant circles is communion, and it's found that way in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16, 1 Corinthians 10, 16. The Greek word is koinonia, and the term koinonia is used of both the body and the blood and the bread and the cup. The Catholic name Mass has no biblical support. So does communion qualify as a service? And the answer would be yes. So we find the three principles. Number one, it was commanded by Messiah in Luke 22, verses 19 and 20. Luke 22, 19 and 20. It was practiced in the book of Acts, at least 3 occasions. Chapter 2, verse 42 and verse 46. Chapter 2, verses 42, 46, and chapter 20, verse 7, 20, verse 7. And in 2 places, it's expounded upon in the epistles. In 1 Corinthians 10, verses 16 and 17, 1 Corinthians 10, 16 and 17, and chapter 11, verses 23 through 31. Chapter 11, verses 23 through 31. What about the purposes? Let me give you four possibilities. The key one that is clearly mentioned is to serve as a memorial, to serve as a remembrance of both the life and the death of the Messiah. That's Luke chapter 22, verse 19, 22 and 19. And that will follow the Jewish pattern. The word remember is the most key word in that whole service. Secondly, it announces the basic facts of the gospel. And the basic facts of the gospel is found in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. Number 1, he died for our sins. Number 2, he was buried, the evidence of his death. And number 3, he rose again on the third day. And the fact that it shows as a memorial, and the basic facts of the gospel is in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 26. The third purpose, to quicken an anticipation of his return. And in 1 Corinthians 11, 26, 1 Corinthians 11, 26, Paul, quoting the Messiah, says, "This do until I come." This is a continuing practice until the second coming of the Messiah. Again, 1 Corinthians 11, 26. Fourthly, to remind us of our oneness with all other believers. To remind us of our oneness with all other believers in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 17. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 17. Now, the next question is, how often should we practice it? And different denominations follow different customs. What we know is that some in the early days of the church, they practiced it every day. In Acts chapter 2, verse 46, 2:46, but later on in the book of Acts, it was practiced on a weekly basis in Acts 20, verse 7, Acts 20, verse 7. But there was no specific command as to how often it should be practiced. And in 1 Corinthians, it says in chapter 11, verse 26, 11:26, as often as you do this. Now keep in mind, it originates from the Passover, so how often was the Passover observed? One time a year. So that would give us a minimum. It should be practiced at least one time a year. And beyond that, every local church can pick their own practice. Most American churches, it's always the first Sunday of each month. It doesn't have to be the first Sunday of each month, but it's a valid choice. The brethren do it weekly. Some Messianic congregations do it quarterly, 3 or 4 times a year. But some also other Messianic congregations do it once a year at the time of the Passover. But these are all valid options. What is mandated is at least once a year. Beyond that, each local church can choose their frequency. Now, as far as the mode of when we practice it, first of all, it's at a time when the church is assembled. It's a church function, a local church function, when the local church is assembled. As in Acts 20, verse 7, Acts 20, verse 7, also 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Corinthians 11, verses 18, 20, 33, 34. I repeat, verses 18, 20, 33, 34. And the specific elements is unleavened bread and the wine. In Jewish practice, we always have wine for Passover. Among brethren, they usually use real wine, but most churches use real grape juice. And the order to distribute the elements, first of all, is the bread, followed by the wine, and believers are to partake of both. Now, what are the prerequisites of being able to partake of it? First of all, it should be limited to people who are truly believers, truly saved, truly born again. So announcement should be made. You have not yet believed the gospel, then we ask you to refrain from it. Otherwise, it's available to all who believe. It's also a possibility. It should be baptized believers, but it's only a possibility. In the New Testament, you were baptized the same day you believed. So people who partook of communion were not only believers, they were baptized believers. Because of so much confusion as to what baptism means and doesn't mean, it's usually wiser to wait a while before we have a chance to disciple a new believer and explain what the issue is. A third requirement is self-examination. That's the point of 1 Corinthians 11, verses 27 through 28. Therefore, we should be conscious. Any sins that we are conscious of before partaking of communion should be confessed. Furthermore, the individual believer should understand whether he's walking orderly with the Lord or not. And so what he should ask is this: do I discern and appreciate that the bread and the wine represents God's atonement accomplished for me on the cross? So we should make these things public, but then what each individual partakes or does not partake is up to that person's choice. Some churches practice closed communion, meaning it's it's intended only for the members of that church. Actually, anyone who has become a believer and is working orderly, even if he's visiting a church, he does not have to refrain from it. He can also partake. But some churches actually do not allow any newcomer to partake of it. And one more thing before we go to the list that I gave you, and that is the specific issue. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians 11. The worst church we have in the New Testament is the Corinthian church. As you read the 1 Corinthian epistle, there was this one key problem after another, after another. Every time Paul issues a new section, he uses the two words peride in English, but concerning this, or but concerning that. And everything they do it wrongly. And they were partaking of the Lord's Supper in a wrongful manner. Some brought extra food but not sharing it. Some drank too much wine and got drunk. Obviously, they were not using grape juice. So skip down now to verse 28. But let a man prove himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he that eats and drinks judgment unto himself, if he discern not the body. Thus, it's important to be sure that we are conscious of any sins that we have not confessed and so on before we partake of it. But let's continue reading. Verse 30, for this cause many among you are weak and sickly, and not a few sleep. So what you learn from verse 30 is God started disciplining the members of this church in three different ways. Some were weak, some were sick, and some already died. So partaking of communion is a serious matter. And in verse 31, but if we discern ourselves, we shall not be judged. So this is the danger of partaking in an unworthy manner. Just like is in this very thing. If in the context of the Jewish Passover, before they'll even partake of the Passover, the house goes to a full-scale spring cleansing. And the purpose of all the cleansing is to remove any leaven from the house. Because as long as there was leaven in the house, they're not worthy to partake of the Passover. And see the analogy here. If we are not doing what we should be doing, we're not worthy to partake of communion. Okay, pull out this one-page thing that you have and get your Bibles ready. A capital A, the preparation for the Seder. Seder is the Hebrew word for the Passover meal. It means order because everything is partaken of in a specific order. And not all of them are in the gospel accounts. Well, the list that you have is the exact list that is followed. And what they didn't record is not in the list. But we'll cover what the list says. Okay, Would you turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 22? And the preparation for the Seder service, for the meal, Luke 22, look at verse 7, Luke 22, 7 and 8. And the day of unleavened bread came, which the Passover must be sacrificed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and make ready for us the Passover, that we may eat. And the preparation involved is a lamb was chosen, and in the mid-afternoon they were taken to the temple compound, and then the lamb would be killed by the shedding of blood at the neck, and then the blood, as they began to pour out, would be put into a bowl, and then the bowl is moved up to the very place where the altar was, and they would pour out the bowl of blood at the base of the altar. And the preparation of the lamb following its death, they would sing Psalms 113 through 118. Psalms 113 through 118. When the lamb was skinned, they would cut it and remove the entrails. And parts were removed that would be given to the altar for the priesthood to partake of, and the rest of the lamb, which is most of it, would be taken to the home, and they'd be roasted at the home. And while the lamb was being roasted, they would prepare some other Passover items. That would include the unleavened bread, get the wine, the bitter herbs, and other types of mixtures that are partaken of at the Passover. Now the Passover bread, which is called matzah, had to have three requirements. Number one, it had to be unleavened. And leaven, if it's used symbolically, is the symbol of sin. Now he identified himself with the bread. It's unleavened, as he was. He was sinless. Two other elements, which were rabbinic additions. The unleavenedness was a biblical element. It had to be striped, and that would correlate with the prophecy of Isaiah 53, with his stripes we are healed. And thirdly, it had to be pierced. So you look at the bread and look it up into light, you would see holes coming through it. So we should remember, he identified his body not with the host, as in Catholicism. He didn't identify his body with any kind of toast or so on. It had to be specifically that kind of bread. Then for the Passover observance, section 151, stay with Luke chapter 22. I look at verse 14. And when the hour was come, he sat down and the apostles with him. He said unto them, With desire have I desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I say unto you, I shall not eat of it until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. The point of a statement is this would be his last Passover. He would not observe it again until the first Passover of the Messianic kingdom, and then he'll observe this Passover with the apostles sitting with him. Now we come to capital C, the first cup. In the Passover service, they drink 4 cups of wine, of which only 2 are mentioned in the Gospels, specifically the Gospel of Luke. So Luke 22, verse 17 and 18, he received a cup. When given thanks, he said, Take this and devour it among yourselves, for I say unto you, I shall not eat from henceforth of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God shall come. She announces to them this is the last Passover he'll share with them. until the kingdom is finally set up. The term fruit of the vine is not referring to grape juice. The fruit of the vine was a phrase used for the Passover wine. That's a technical name for Passover wine, which was fermented. A capital D, the washing of the feet and the first prediction of the betrayal by Judas. For this, you need to turn to John chapter 13. John chapter 13. We don't read the whole passage, but the verses are verses 1 through 20. Verses 1 through 20. Normally at a Passover, following the partaking of the first cup of wine, what happens in the next part of the ceremony is the washing of the hands. And the servants in a situation what they would do, they would have a towel wrapped around their waist, and they would have a bowl and a pitcher. And they would go to each one around the Passover table, and people partaking of the ceremony would put their fingers over the bowl, and then they would pour wine over his fingers, and then they can dry up with the towel on the waist. So the normal Jewish pattern is the washing of the hands. But here Yeshua breaks that pattern, and he didn't ask for a servant to do this, he takes the role of a servant. Going from apostle to apostle, washing their feet. And for Peter, that was sort of an embarrassment. And when the Messiah came to his feet, he says, I'm not going to let you wash my feet. The Messiah said, if I don't get to wash your feet, you will have no part with me, especially the part in the kingdom. And so Peter responds, well, in that case, give me a bath. That's what he says, give me a bath. But the lesson was people who didn't have baths in their own homes, which was only for the wealthy class, what they would do, they would go to the bathhouse and they would immerse themselves in the water, but as it's already in the dry side of the calendar, so as they walk back home, the feet would get dusty again. And so when walking in the house, all they needed was to wash their feet. There's no need to give a full-scale bath again. Also at this point, he makes a first indication of the coming betrayal. In verse 18, I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen. The scriptures may be fulfilled. He that eats my bread lifts up his heels against me. That's the first implication that one of the 12 men will betray him that night. Now we come to Kapali de Karpas. And let's go ahead and turn to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 26, and the verses are 21 through 25, 21 through 25. Following the washing of the hands in the Jewish service is on the Passover plate in the center table, there's usually a green vegetable, in most cases parsley, but it's also allowed any green vegetable. And in the center of the table, there are several cups of salt water. And so there'd be an easy salt water dish with an easy reach of 3 or 4 of the apostles. So they would take the green parsley and immerse it, dip it into the salt water, and then they would eat it. This harks back to what happened at the Exodus. Green is a symbol of spring, and spring is the symbol of youth. And the symbol is that when we were just a young nation in the springtime of our nationhood, God saved us by means of the salt waters of the Red Sea. because as the Egyptians were chasing the Israelites, they were in danger. What God did was divide the Red Sea. The Jews crossed on dry land. When the Egyptian army tried to follow them, the walls of water caved in on them and drowned the whole army. So in the springtime of our nation, God saved us by means of the salt waters of the Red Sea. And the reason it's salty is because the Red Sea is salty. The green is to emphasize the springtime when these events happened. In the Jewish community in places like Israel and here in USA is largely secular. In both Israel and here, the Orthodox Jewish community is only about 20, at the most 25%, but or less. And so, as the story is, there was a Baptist family and a Jewish family, a very secular Jewish family, moved in next door. They both families had the same age sons, and so the two sons got to be friends. And one day the Baptist son asked the Jewish son to come with him to the Baptist church, the Baptist Sunday school. The Jewish boy asked his parents. They made him a bit nervous, but they were not really practicing Jews, didn't want to make it an issue. So he told him, you can go this one time. But when you come back, make sure you tell us everything they taught you in the Baptist school. And just in case we have to give you a different perspective. Well, afterwards, the two boys went to their own homes. And the Jewish parents took their son, asked him, what did they teach you in that Baptist school? And the son says, oh, they taught us all about Moses. The parents are surprised. Really, about Moses? Yes. Well, what did they teach you about Moses? Give us some details. Well, what they taught us is that as Moses led us out of Egypt, the Egyptian army began chasing us. And so what Moses did is he built a pontoon bridge across the Red Sea. As the Jews were running across the pontoon bridge, then the Egyptian army began chasing them on the pontoon bridge. So what Moses did next was to call for an airstrike and destroyed the bridge, and that's how the Jews were saved. The Jewish parents were quite surprised. Is that really what they taught you at that Baptist school? And the son says, well, that's not the way they put it. If I taught you what they really said, you'd never believe it. And that catches the Jewish community today quite well. Let's move on to the next element. The breaking of the middle matzah. Now some background. In the center table is one bag. It could be square, it could be round, with different designs on it. It's divided into three elements. And before this ceremony we're about to see, they take 3 loaves of bread and put it inside each of these three compartments. You have one bag with 3 compartments. It contains 3 loaves of unleavened bread, but in those 3 loaves, they're separated distinctly by a single sheet. And at this point, where you're coming to, the one who officiates takes out the middle loaf. He will break it in half. He will then wrap up the half of it in a linen cloth. Will then hide it somewhere. And then sometime later in the service, he'll send out the children to find it. And the one who finds it gets a small reward. But then when it comes back to the officiator, what he does is he breaks small pieces of the half that was hidden away. And each one partakes of the middle loaf. Now coming to the breaking the middle matzah, let's look at Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, verse 19. Luke 22, verse 19. And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance." See the key word? In remembrance of me. Not transubstantiation, it's not consubstantiation. It's simply a memorial, a remembrance of his body and what it cost him to provide salvation for us all. Let's go on now to the sop. Let's look at John chapter 13. John chapter 13. Here we have the third prediction of the coming betrayal. The next ceremony is called the ceremony of what is called a small sandwich. What the officiator now does, he breaks two pieces of matzah about the size of an olive, and then he distributes them. Well, before he distributes them, what he does, he puts a little bit of the haroset. The haroset is a mixture of chopped apples, nuts, honey, cinnamon, and wine. And he puts some of that on one section of the bread, and on top of that, a good portion of horseradish. Then he puts the other little piece of bread on, so you have a small sandwich. And the purpose is to be able to shed tears. You ever had horseradish? Too much of it, what happens? You begin to cry. And that's why they're responsible to partake of a good portion of the horseradish to bring tears to the eye. And the horseradish does its job very well. A lot better than Tristan. And the purpose here is to remember that when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, they had to shed tears, bitter tears, over their enslavement. And that's referred to as the sop, the little sandwich. And the first one and as he makes these 12 little sandwiches, the one normally to receive the first sop is given a position of honor. It doesn't happen here. The first sop is given to Judas. And he tells Judas, what you do quickly. And Judas now knows that Jesus is aware of the conspiracy against him. And again, the focus is to bring tears to the eye, and no doubt tears came into his own eye once he realized one of his own 12 is about to betray him. Now, following the sop, that's when they have the 4-course meal. There'll be an appetizer, the soup, usually a matzah ball soup, and a main course. And when they finish the meal, they come to the third cup. Now look at Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, verse 20, 22:20. And the cup in like manner after supper. That's how we know it's the third cup. The first and the second cup is not mentioned here. But the second cup, first and second cup comes before dinner. Immediately after dinner, they partake of the third cup, and the third cup is called the cup of the redemption. The cup of the redemption, symbolizing the blood of the lamb that was placed upon the lintel and doorposts of the Jewish homes in Egypt, so that the being protected by the blood of the Lamb. So he specifies that the cup after supper, this cup is new covenant in my blood, even that which is poured out for you. And so the third cup is connected with his actual blood. The capital I, lesson in greatness. Okay, turn to Luke chapter 22. Stay with Luke 22. That's verses 24 through 30. 24 through 30. Because there's a long period of discussions and so on that happens during the dinner time before the second ceremony, which is shorter than the first ceremony. They began to be arguing who among them is going to be the greatest in the Messianic kingdom. And so teach them, greatness is not going to be defined or determined by who's done the most, but who's been the most humble. So verse 26, but he that is greater among you, let him become as the younger. He that is chief, so he does as he that does the serving. At the end of verse 27, I am in the midst of you as he that serves. He played a servant. This was the second member of the Godhead, but he played a role of a servant in his first coming. And the promise is, notice in verse 30, that ye may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and ye shall sit on the throne, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So each of the 12 tribes, each of the 12 tribes will be under the authority of a specific apostle. And that's the lesson in greatness. A capital J, the prediction of Peter's denial. There's a lot of material in this section. But that's where he lets Peter know that before the second cock crowing, he'll deny that he believes in Jesus 3 different times. So he does is announce several things. Number one, announcing of his coming arrest and therefore the dispersion, the scattering of the apostles. Secondly, after the resurrection, they are to meet him in the Galilee. This is the first of such command given to them. There's some others later on beyond the Passover. Thirdly, Peter will in the future follow Messiah in crucifixion. Peter now knows he won't die of old age. He'll be old when he dies, but it's not of old age that he will die. And by church tradition, he was crucified and the cross upside down. Fourthly, there is a spiritual warfare over Peter. And Satan is going to be attacking him, and he will slip. He will slip. But he will not fall from the faith. Fifthly, once he has turned, he is to establish the other apostles. And so he became the first apostle to see the resurrected Messiah, not the first one to see him resurrected, but the first of the apostles to see him resurrected. And now we come to the Hallel. And now look at Matthew 26. verse 30, Matthew 26, verse 30, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out unto the Mount of Olives. Actually, in Greek, it doesn't say they sang a hymn. It's a verb. They hymned. They hymned. And the end of the Passover, what they do, they sang a hymn, which is Psalms 113 through 118. Psalm 113 through 118. And with that, the Passover comes to a close. There are other elements in the Passover that are not dealt with by the Gospels, but these are the specific elements that you can find that the Gospels refer to. I've come to this congregation many times now, so most of you are familiar with our ministry. Those of you may be new, just a couple of things without repeating too much. In that the name Ariel means Lion of God. We chose that name for ministry to emphasize what we are. We're a Messianic Jewish ministry doing two things. Number one, reaching out to the Jewish community. But secondly, a disciple about Jewish and Gentile believers, which is done through our writings on the table, which is also done through our branches in now 13 different countries. We have now a wider ministry. This is a ministry that we had even before we all got started. We have a summer school program that now runs for 8 weeks. And you can pick up one of these to get the details. What you will see is we begin with a 2-week curriculum, followed by a 3-week curriculum, followed by a 1-week curriculum, and then followed by a 2-week curriculum, and we conclude with the Labor Day weekend. Now, all our courses in our 5-year cycles, you have to come for 5 summers to get everything we offer. But the one course we teach every year because of its importance is the 1-week course on the 6th week, which is the Life of Messiah from a Messianic Jewish perspective. It's a 25-hour course. We covered that in 1 week with 3 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. So you'll have 1 week and come to that one. You have 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You're free the whole summer, come on over. It's up in the Adirondacks, 40 miles south of the Canadian border. I live in San Antonio, and you live further south, and you can both testify with me. July and August is a good time to get out of this hothouse and come to the upstate New York and enjoy the kind of weather we have up there. A time of learning, a time of fellowship, and things of that nature. So just grab one of these, and I'll give you the information. Something that's new in the last 3 years or 4 years is our online school. These are courses you can actually take for credit. You'll see this brochure on the table, and slowly we are adding more and more courses. So inside this is a loose leaf element, and it tells you what's available already. It'll be making more courses available as time goes on. So just pick those up and see, and you're welcome to study those right at your own computer. One more thing is that we also publish a magazine, the Ariel magazine, and in this magazine, we usually have 5 or 6 different biblical courses, but also gives you information about how our different branches in those 13 countries are doing. You'll see a complete list of all our staff around the world. So you can get a hold of it, and this, you can take these courses with credit, without credit, and things of that nature. So this will give you more courses you can take of that same Messianic Jewish perspective. And if you receive the magazine, we don't charge for the magazine. In the blue brochure, there's a place that you can get a hold of it. There's 2 ways you can get this. If you like the hard copy like this, then give us your full name and address so we can mail it to you. This also comes out as an email. If you prefer the email edition, then just give us your email address and that will take you to email address to take you to on the course on the computer, and not have to get the magazine. I prefer the magazine myself. Okay, I believe we take the offering at the back. Am I right? Okay. So now I'm going to do the questions. So we're taking the offering first? Oh, no. No, go ahead and take the offering first, and then we'll go into the, okay.